So Kai, welcome to Chautauqua. Good to be with you again.
Well, thank you, Michael. It's a really lovely venue. I'm delighted to be here.
So the last time Kai and I spoke in Cleveland, in the middle of our program, there was an aria by an opera singer, and we rolled the Marley floor out. So Kai will be dancing in the middle of our presentation today as an added bonus. Last time we were chatting, we were looking at the life of Oppenheimer through the lens of power. And today we'll take a slight detour on that and probe on our theme on what we got wrong, if we got anything wrong. But because this is your first time at Chautauqua, I want to start with you. You're a prolific biographer, and you've selected subjects, all of whom really could fit into this theme today. Could you tell our audience a little bit about how you pick your subjects? You know, what prompts you to explore the lives of the people that you look at?
Well, as your introduction made clear, I'm a bit of a dilettante. And I jump from one subject to another, from Jimmy Carter, my last biography 2 years ago, to the Middle East, to Oppenheimer, to John J. McCloy, a powerful Wall Street lawyer. And, you know, to answer your question, you know, the biographer has to be obsessed. Biography is really the most rigorous form of scholarship. Most biographies take at least 5 years. My first took 10. Robert Oppenheimer, Martin Sherwin, and I took 25 years to do that book. So you have to be really careful about, you have to be certain that you have an immense curiosity about the subject. And in my case, I choose these figures because I'm interested in how power works in America. And this is one theme that connects all of my books, is the nature of power in this complicated democracy. My next book, by the way, I'm working now on Roy Cohn. Listen to that.
So I think advanced sales are going well for you already.
That's a typical response when I say that. People groan and say, oh no. But Roy Cohn is a fascinating figure, and he explains something about our divisive politics today. And the working title of it, by the way, is American Scoundrel.
Do you feel better? We're going to spend quite a bit of time looking at Oppenheimer today. I think he provides a really interesting lens for our theme. But how did you land at Robert Oppenheimer, and what was it like trying to reconstruct that life?
Well, Robert Oppenheimer, of course, is the father of the atomic bomb. He's a seminal figure in the 20th century American history. He gave us the atomic age. He's a really important figure historically. I came to him because I had written a biography of John McCloy, this Wall Street lawyer who was a friend of Oppenheimer's. And then my next book was a biography of McGeorge Bundy, who was also a friend of Oppenheimer's. And McGeorge Bundy, of course, was a major architect of the war in Vietnam as National Security Advisor. John McCloy had played this sort of behind-the-scenes role throughout the 20th century, a friend to every president from Roosevelt through Reagan. Both men knew Oppenheimer, and so I had to write a little bit about Oppenheimer along the way. But after I'd finished Bundy, the second biography in 1998, I was unemployed, and my wife turned to me and said, you know, isn't it time for you to get a real job now with a salary? And of course, she had been supporting my work as a freelance biographer all these years. And I looked around and I tried to get an academic job, but I don't have a PhD. Finally, my friend Martin Sherwin came to me, and he had been working on Oppenheimer since 1980. And in the year 2000, he came to me and he said, Kai, why don't you join me? I know you're unemployed. Why don't you join me on my long-standing project and help me finish this humongous biography of Oppenheimer? And initially I told him no because I was afraid of the perils of co-authorship. But it turned into a fabulous collaboration, and I spent 5 years on the book. But by that time, Marty had spent 20 years, and he gathered all this fabulous research. Oppenheimer is a very complicated, mysterious figure, and Marty just couldn't stop doing the research, and he couldn't start to write. And so when I came aboard, I prodded him to write, and I started to write, and we got it done finally. So it only took 25 years.
Well, you really help paint a fascinating picture about the life of Oppenheimer. And when we were in Cleveland, we were really focused on the notion of power and the sequencing of his ascendance from a young scholar to his transformation into a brilliant manager and then a leader, and the way that he maneuvers around all these powerful figures. He always seems to be striving for something. What, in your perspective, is his motivation? What's driving Oppenheimer to ultimately become Oppenheimer?
Well, he's actually a very fragile personality. And he's extremely sensitive. He's highly intelligent, obviously. He came of age right at the moment when quantum physics was coming onto this world stage in the 1920s. He was complicated and ambitious and brilliant as a theoretical physicist. He understood quantum. He could hear the music as such. But he was also a polymath. He was interested in literature and poetry. He wrote poetry himself. He was of Jewish ancestry, but he'd been raised in the Ethical Culture Society in New York City, a sort of secular religion. And at one point in his life, he actually became interested in Hindu mysticism and the Bhagavad Gita, and so much so that he decided, this is in the 1930s, he decided to study Sanskrit so he could read the Gita in the original, which led one of his close friends, Isidore Rabi, the famous physicist, who's portrayed in the movie with him. Rabi at one point said, Rabi was raised himself in a Jewish Orthodox family. Rabi at one point said, Robert Oppenheimer might have been a much better physicist if he had read a little more of the Talmud and less of the Gita. Anyway, Oppenheimer was really complicated and mysterious. He had this love of physics, but he also, as a young man, had been sent out at the age of 18 to New Mexico, this New York City boy, and he fell in love with New Mexico, the Spartan high plains, the horseback riding. And he turned to his brother Frank at one point in the 1930s and said, I would be very happy in my life if I could find some way to combine my love for physics with my love for New Mexico. Well, of course he did. He built this secret city in Los Alamos, 40 miles down the road from his ranch that he had bought in the late 20s. And gave us the atomic bomb.
Well, so let's talk about the process of getting to the bomb, because this week we're looking at the question of what we got wrong and what we can learn from it. But before we go into that maybe not so simple question, did Oppenheimer ever pause along the way to ask the question about whether he should pursue the bomb at all?
He had been raised, as I mentioned, in the Ethical Culture Society and the Ethical Culture School, where they taught students to grapple with ethical questions. So yes, this was on his mind. But in the 1930s, he had been politicized. He had initially been rather apolitical, focused on his physics. But he met a young woman, it's always a young woman, who nagged him to become more aware, to become more involved in the world, the real world, and to become aware of the depression that they were all living through in the 1930s. This young woman, Jean Tatlock, was a member of the Communist Party, studying to become a psychiatrist, a medical doctor in Berkeley. She politicized Oppenheimer and persuaded him to become more politically active. And so by the late 1930s, he was extremely aware of the dangers of fascism that was rising in Germany. And so when the war broke out, he was, aghast at what was happening to his people, the Jews in Europe. He gave lots of money to help rescue Jews out of Europe. He gave lots of money, about $400 a year, to activities sponsored by the Communist Party. And then when America entered the war, he was desperate to participate, to do something to help win the war. And then in 1939, even before America joined the war, he became aware of the fact that fission had happened. There had been an experimental discovery of the fact of fission. And, within hours, he was at the blackboard writing formula and figuring out that, yes, if this was possible, then it was also theoretically possible to build a really enormous bomb. And he knew that the German physicists with whom he had studied with in Germany as a young man in his 20s were just as capable of understanding this physics as he was. And so he feared that those German physicists, people like Werner Heisenberg, were going to give the bomb to Hitler and he would win the war with it. So when given the opportunity to join the Manhattan Project and become scientific director of Los Alamos, he jumped at the opportunity. He thought it was a moral imperative to do this. But, 2 years into the project, he's on the cusp of giving this weapon of mass destruction to America. He still had, moral qualms about it. He understood it was a terrible weapon that was going to completely change the nature of warfare, and he worried about the moral complexities of this. And I'll tell you one, just to try to finish this answer. I'm sorry it's too long, but I can't resist telling this one story. In about 2003, in the midst of writing American Prometheus, I suddenly discovered that Ann Wilson was living just a mile away from me, and she was Oppenheimer's last secretary at Los Alamos. And she was still alive. I was stunned. I went over immediately to interview her. We had an incredible conversation about Oppenheimer. And actually, at one point, she pulled out a photo book for me, and it was a collection of Alfred Eisenstadt's portraits, famous photographer. And she turned to a page of this portrait of Robert Oppenheimer that you see on the cover of American Prometheus, with him with a cigarette dangling in his mouth and staring straight into the camera, and just, a powerful image. You see into the soul of Robert Oppenheimer in that photograph. And I immediately said to myself, oh my God, this is the cover of the book. But in the course of that interview, Ann Wilson told me this story. She says, one day in 1945, just after the Trinity test, after the fact that the bomb had been successfully tested, I was walking to work one day with Robert, and he suddenly started muttering to himself, "Those poor little people, those poor little people." And she stopped him and said, "Robert, what are you talking about?" And he said, "Well, the Trinity shows the test, the bomb works, the gadget works, as they referred to it. And now it's going to be used on a Japanese city, And the victims are going to be women and children and old men, very few soldiers. And he was worrying about this. You know, this is 3 weeks before Hiroshima. What's interesting about that story is that that same week, he was also meeting with the bombardiers who are going to be on the Enola Gay, and he was instructing them exactly at what altitude they should release the gadget and at what altitude it should be ignited to have the most destructive, to inflict the highest number of casualties, civilian casualties. So this is a complicated man. He's doing his duty, fulfilling his responsibilities to the War Department, and at the same time he's worrying, about the consequences of his own actions. I think this captures the complexity of Robert Oppenheimer.
So last week we were looking at artificial intelligence, and one of our speakers said, in response to how do we think about guardrails around this, the good guys need to get there first. Is that your sense of Oppenheimer's mindset around the atomic bomb? Because you're talking about his moral wrestling, but I'm also not hearing at any point did he think, ooh, let's pull back and not do this.
Right. Well, I think on the question of AI, yes, we're facing actually another Oppenheimer moment, where suddenly a new technology that has enormous potential, but enormous potential for destruction and evil and disruption. And we need smart people, scientists in particular, to be talking to us about the consequences and the moral and ethical choices we face. And Robert Oppenheimer was trying to do this with the gadget. And, immediately after Hiroshima, he supported this. This was his gadget. He invented it. He knew it was going to be used in combat. He actually made an argument to his fellow physicists that we have to show the horribleness of this weapon in combat in this war, because otherwise people won't understand. And the next war, if we don't demonstrate the ferocity of this weapon in this war, then the next war is going to be fought by 2 or 3 adversaries, each of whom will be armed with nuclear weapons, and it will be Armageddon. So that's a powerful argument. And yet, when it happened, after Hiroshima and Nagasaki, Robert Oppenheimer plunged into a deep depression. We know this from Kitty, his wife's letters to her friends, where she says, I'm not sure Robert is going to survive. He was so depressed. He recovered, and then he spent essentially the rest of his life trying to warn us. Trying to warn us of the dangers of what he himself had created. And the theme of this week is mistakes. Well, Robert Oppenheimer's whole life was trying to warn us that we need to understand that these are weapons not of defense. These are weapons for, literally he gives a speech 3 months after Hiroshima in which he says, these are weapons for aggressors. These are weapons of terror. And this was a weapon that in the first instance was used on a virtually already defeated enemy. And then he goes on to explain, that any country, however poor, if they so decide they need to acquire these weapons, they will be able to do so because there are no secrets. There's no secrets to the physics. It's simply an engineering problem. And so what we need to do, he was telling Harry Truman and Eisenhower and other American policymakers in the late 40s and 50s, we need to contain this weapon. We need to treat it like chemical warfare was treated after World War I and ban it and create an international authority to regulate and inspect every factory and every laboratory in the world to make sure that these weapons are not being built. Well, our politicians and other politicians around the world ignored this advice it was a mistake, and instead we engaged in a global arms race with nuclear weapons, with thousands and thousands being built. And we're still living with this overwhelming threat to humanity. And I think it's been over 75 years, but we've grown to be very complacent, living with the bomb. And I think in the last 2 years, we've sort of been reminded because of the war in Ukraine that actually these things could be used in combat again. So we went down in 1945, 46, 47, when we had an opportunity maybe to put controls on these weapons. We did not do so, and I would argue on the theme of this week's that this was a mistake.
You got a chance to dive deep into Oppenheimer's thinking, not only in letters, but in talking to folks. I was really struck by the moral dilemma that gets presented around the Trinity test, and how stark that is. What did you learn about what's going on in Oppenheimer's mind? And share for those who may not have seen. How many have read the book or seen the movie, just for context? Okay, so lots of folks. But so for the few that haven't, repaint that scene, because it is so stark. And what moral considerations, or how is he thinking through that decision before the bomb's even fully able to be dropped?
So you're talking about the Trinity test. Yeah.
Yep.
Well, as you see in the movie, it's portrayed very dramatically, but I would say accurately. It's they really did the night before the Trinity test, late in the early morning hours, the physicists who had worked so hard on building this gadget were taking bets on whether whether it would explode with 1,000 tons of TNT or 5,000, or whether indeed it might ignite the atmosphere and destroy the whole world. Oppenheimer, that actually was taken seriously for a few weeks early in the project in 1943. Edward Teller had done some calculations that suggested that maybe a test of the gadget could actually ignite the atmosphere and destroy the world. And Oppenheimer took it so seriously that it got on a train, as it's depicted in the film Oppenheimer, and he goes back east to consult with another physicist, and not Einstein, actually. That's a simplification, but he went to another physicist, Compton, and decided that Teller's calculations were wrong, and that the chances of igniting the atmosphere were near zero.
Oh, good, near zero.
But these were really big existential questions on the eve of Trinity. Oppenheimer didn't believe he was going to ignite the atmosphere, but he did understand that he was inaugurating the atomic age and that the nature of warfare was going to change. His hope was that it would, in the words of Niels Bohr, the sort of godfather of quantum physics, the Danish physicist, when Niels Bohr arrived in Los Alamos on the last day of 1943, he had one question for Oppenheimer. He says, "Robert, just tell me, is it big enough? Is the gadget going to be big enough when it explodes that it will frighten all of humanity into realizing that we can have no more war?" And that was actually Oppenheimer's hope. It was, I think, a little naive, but those were some of the sort of essential questions that were being asked on the eve of Trinity.
So you had noted how long the book took to come out, and to be in creation, and then here comes the movie. There's been a huge resurgence of interest, as you said to me in Cleveland. It took folks long enough to figure out that the book was there. What has that been like for you since Chris's film came out?
Well, it's a Hollywood miracle for an author. American Prometheus came out in 2005 after 25 years of research and writing. It got terrific reviews everywhere, sold very modestly, never got on any bestseller lists. And three different parties, different Hollywood directors and scriptwriters made stabs at attempting to do a film starting in 2006, and they all failed. And by 2021, Marty Sherwin and I had given up on Hollywood. We thought this story is too complicated for Hollywood to grasp. It's too controversial. The history is just beyond Hollywood's ability to capture. And then came Christopher Nolan. And the first I heard of it was a little one-paragraph item in Hollywood Variety saying Christopher Nolan's next film is going to be on Oppenheimer. And I called my agent and asked, do you know anything about this? And a day later, I got a phone call saying Christopher Nolan would like to talk to you. And we had a phone chat, and he confirmed that yes, he was doing a film on Oppenheimer, and it was based on American Prometheus, and he was picking up the film option that was still out there. And we had a meeting in New York a couple of weeks later, and he explained that he had read the book. This is what's incredible about this story. It's very unusual. He explained that he had picked up the book. He'd been given the book in March of 21 and read it, fell in love with it, and decided without contacting us, without trying to do anything, he just wanted to see if he could sit down and write a screenplay that he thought would do justice to the book. And it took him 5 months, and by September of 21, he thought he had something he could sell to a studio, and that's when he called me up. And when we met, he still wasn't ready to share the screenplay because it wasn't finished, and he said he always works very confidentially. And the sad thing about this is that just a couple of weeks after this meeting, Marty Sherwin, my co-author, died of small cell lung cancer. So Marty never got a chance to see the script or the film, but I think he would have been very pleased. And Nolan shared the screenplay finally with me in February of 2022. And he did so escorting me into a boutique hotel room in Greenwich Village, handed me this top secret script, and said, take as long as you need to read it, I'll be waiting downstairs. He really does work in secret. He didn't want this to get out, but he wanted my feedback on the screenplay before he started before the photography started. And literally after reading the script, which I was sort of blown away by, it's an amazing screenplay. It really captures the book in its complexity. It captures the personality of Oppenheimer and his moral dilemmas, his personality, his love life, his politics. It's really quite, reflective of the book. The book, of course, can do much more than the film. The film is 3 hours, but it can't capture everything in a 720-page manuscript. But anyway, he's Nolan. I am very grateful to. I think he's a brilliant director and screenplay writer, and he's been very gracious in giving credit to the book at the Academy Awards, for instance.
So you mentioned some lessons you think that Oppenheimer picks up even in his lifetime. I'm curious, given how much time you spent with looking at his life and now the film is out, if you were starting the book today, given what we know of what's happened in history, would you view Oppenheimer differently? Would you take a different tact, or perhaps a different way to think about that is when you started this journey with your co-author, there's the modern day context of a way to look at Oppenheimer. What's changed, and what lesson does he provide for us today that maybe he didn't even 10 years ago?
Well, you know, biography is complicated, but it has a fairly simple formula. It's chronology. And when you start to write, you start with the childhood and you work your way through the life. And as a biographer, I've always believed that the story, that the themes and your understanding of your subject will emerge from the facts, will emerge from the chronology, from the telling of the story. And this is what happened with Oppenheimer. His story is so very relevant to our times for a number of reasons. Obviously, because he gave us the atomic age, which we're always going to be living with. But it's also, his life story is a window into the politics of mid-century America, specifically McCarthyism, the great witch hunt of Joe McCarthy, in which Robert Oppenheimer, became the sort of chief celebrity victim during that trial. And then the other relevancy is, of course, he is a scientist, a brilliant scientist, and we're a society just drenched in technology and science and grappling with a rapidly changing world, and AI is going to just change our world in the next 5 to 10 years in ways that we probably can't even imagine yet. And so his story as a scientist is so very relevant. I don't know, coming back to your question though, one of the reasons I was so happy with Nolan's take in the film was that he just didn't tell the story of the atomic bomb. That was actually a secondary story to the fact of what happened to Oppenheimer's life after the bomb. And I think that story is so very relevant to both understanding Oppenheimer himself, but also understanding ourselves. We're still living with McCarthyism. We're still living with that sort of divisive politics, the politics of fear, the politics of false facts, and the politics of smear, and it's a really relevant story for all of those reasons.
You, both in the book and then of course we see in the film the notion of the celebration of the scientist. Oppenheimer's on the cover of Time magazine, he's consulting with the most powerful people. And now we find ourselves in an era in which science is questioned as if it's somehow, you get multiple versions of science. How do you reflect on the current moment of mistrust we have in the world where even science gets shouted down? I mean, that's certainly, you're reflecting on some ways that was similar for Oppenheimer, but as you chronicled his life, there was a belief that what he was going through and and demonstrating had some basis in fact, and we find ourselves with such a distrust of even science today.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, what happened to Oppenheimer in 1954 in that security hearing, he was, in the words of Edward Teller, he was defrocked in his own church. He was discredited, and the fact that they could take away his security clearance and then after a month-long secret kangaroo court of a hearing, they could leak the entire transcript of that hearing, revealing his private life, his love affairs, his rumors about his politics, the insinuation that because he was a man of the left in the 1930s, it's a question, was he pink or was he fully red? The insinuation was there that he was disloyal and perhaps a spy for the Soviets, none of which was true. But it discredited him. It took this America's most famous scientist at the time, aside from Einstein, and it made him no longer able to function as a public intellectual. He'd been a famous man up until 1954. After 1954, he was a pariah. He was disinvited from even university venues giving speeches. And this sent a message to all scientists in America, but everywhere, that you should beware as a scientist of getting out of your narrow lane and pretending that you can use your status as an expert, as a scientist, to be able to pontificate on politics, on policy, on public policy. And so this is carried over. I think, it's one reason, what happened to Oppenheimer in 1954 is one reason why we no longer in America have any, really famous public intellectuals who are scientists. They have tended over the last few generations to stick in their narrow lane and not get into politics. And this, I think, is a mistake because, as I said, we're drenched as our society in science and technology, and we don't understand it. And we need scientists to be able to debate amongst themselves. So during the pandemic, you had a wave of distrust of public health officials, a wave of distrust of science. And this is a reflection that people, the average citizen apparently doesn't understand that what scientists do is experiment, try to hypothesize what is happening and have an experiment and learn from the science. And sometimes you're wrong. Sometimes, you make mistakes. You have a hypothesis that doesn't work out. And yet we're so vulnerable to the technology that we have created that we really need to understand that we need to be careful with technology. We need to be careful with nuclear weapons. We need to be careful with AI. And this is the lesson we should learn from Oppenheimer's life.
I want to pivot. I know our audience will have lots of questions for you on Oppenheimer, but I want to spend a little time on Jimmy Carter.
Okay, excellent.
Your biography on President Carter was titled The Unfinished Presidency, and you list so many battles that President Carter waged that will sound pretty familiar to us today. Debates about national health care, growing inequality and racism, the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. In keeping with our theme for this week, what did Carter get right or wrong? And maybe more importantly, what lessons should we pull from his presidency to today?
Well, Jimmy Carter famously said he made a mistake with the Iran hostage rescue mission. He should have sent in one more helicopter. Actually, in my take on this and the outlier, the unfinished presidency of Jimmy Carter, I argue that the whole idea that you could send in helicopters to put in a rescue team into the heart of Tehran was a fantastical notion. It was inevitably going to fail. It was a much too complicated operation. And another helicopter wouldn't have made any difference at all. Anyway, Jimmy Carter's presidency is really quite interesting. Most people think of his ex-presidency as a model for an ex-president and regard his presidency as a failed one because he failed to get reelected. But actually, his presidency was quite consequential. He saved Social Security. He gave us seat belts and airbags that is still saving 10,000 lives every year. He started this debate on national health care. He failed to get it largely because of opposition from Ted Kennedy and from the Republican opposition. In foreign policy, he gave us human rights as a keystone of our foreign policy, which is a really central sort of idealistic American idea. And, no politician has really been able to walk away from that. He, had all sorts of successes in foreign policy, specifically the Camp David treaty between Egypt and Israel. And yet, Jimmy Carter, and this is a little controversial to say, but it's so very relevant to what's going on in the newspaper headlines today, we're still wrestling with this terrible Arab-Israeli conflict, the Palestinian-Israeli conflict, and yet people forget that Jimmy Carter in 1978, 79 got into this terrible dispute with the Prime Minister of Israel, Menachem Begin, over what? The settlements. He had argued at the Camp David negotiations in September of 78 that not only do you need to have a peace treaty with Egypt, but you need to have an agreement not to build any more settlements in the West Bank, because to do so would close off the option for Palestinian self-rule, autonomy, and eventually what they were talking about was a two-state solution. And indeed, Carter has been proven prophetic on this delicate, highly controversial issue. Now we face in the West Bank not 20,000 settlers, but 700,000. And it's going to be very difficult to weave our way to a two-state solution. And yet I think and Jimmy Carter believes that's the only solution on the table that is realistic and moral. And yet here we are, stuck.
So speaking of today's headlines, there's a lot of debate, of course, swirling about the next election and whether President Biden should drop out. And I'm not going to put you on the spot on that particular question. But as a biographer of presidents and of great moments in history, what should we as a voting public be thinking about as it relates to the decision that President Biden has before him?
Well, it's very interesting. Joe Biden was the first U.S. senator to endorse Jimmy Carter for his 1976 run. Very improbable run for the White House in 1976. This unknown Georgia peanut farmer, ex-governor. But Biden saw in Carter something that he identified with, and indeed their politics are very similar. They're both sort of democratic centrists. They're both very pragmatic. They're both extremely decent, moral human beings. And And, I like Jimmy Carter, who famously said that he was running to do the right thing. I think Joe Biden has also always had that as his mantra as a politician. There's been no personal scandals involving either Jimmy or Joe. And yet I suspect that if Jimmy had a phone call with Joe today, he might suggest to Joe that, the ex-presidency is not so bad. You can still accomplish. But that's just a guess.
Well, so let's spend our last few minutes before we turn it to the audience for questions, which are already coming in, just sharing a little bit more about where you think your journey on Roy Cohn is going to take you, and when do you think we'll be able to read it?
Most biographies, take at least 5 years. I've been working on this one with my wife, Susan, for just a year and a half. And the bad news for this biographer is that Roy Cohn destroyed all his papers. Not surprisingly. He was not paying his taxes the last 5 to 10 years of his life. He was a lawyer representing all 5 mob families in New York City. He destroyed every piece of paper. So that's the bad news for the biographer, and also the good news, because I don't have to spend years going through box after box. But it's a little harder to reconstruct his life as a result. And but we're finding people to interview, and I've already started to write. And it's a great story. It's very colorful. It's and I'll say, oddly enough, in my career as a biographer, I wrote about John McCloy, George Bundy, Robert Oppenheimer, Jimmy Carter. In all 4 of those books, I also write a little bit about Roy Cohn in each of those books. And it's interesting in that it's sort of a revelation to me. As I was starting Roy Cohn, I thought back to this, and I said, yeah, in my portrait of Roy Cohn is in John McCloy's biography, or the Bundy biography, or Jimmy Carter. It's just a few paragraphs, and Roy Cohn pops up as this annoying scoundrel who's done something nefarious. And I portray him as sort of a secondary, inconsequential figure. But I suddenly realized as I sat down to tackle Roy Cohn's life that maybe I had it wrong. And that all these years I was paying attention to writing the biographies of these powerful establishment figures, powerful Wall Street lawyers, Harvard deans, a president. And yet, in a way, that old American establishment is gone today. It's no longer, we no longer have that sort of bipartisan Republican Democratic mix of powerful lawyers and business leaders and foundation presidents who provide a sort of elite advisory group to a president or to our national leadership. Instead, we have the divisive politics of one Roy Cohn, who is haunting us from his grave, and who, is the kind of lawyer who said, "Don't tell me about the law, tell me who the judge is." Who was very good at sort of doubling down on the big lie. And, this sounds a little familiar to our current politics.